היי ברווזונים, איזה כיף שחזרתם. כאילו יש לכם ברירה. סתם, יש לכם, אתם יכולים לקרוא לבד, זה גם בסדר. מה שאתם רוצים. Chapter 5, The Wave, היידה. The next day, the students drifted in slowly as usual. Some took their seats, others stood around talking. Robert Billings was by the windows, tying knots in the blind cords. While he was doing that, Fred, his incessant tormentor, walked past and patted him on the back, sticking a small sign that said, "Kick me," to his shirt. יום רגיל בבית ספר, רוברט בילינגס קושר את השרוכים של הווילון, כי רוברט הוא כזה, ואז בא הברד, זה שואב להתעלל בו, ומדביק לו קיק מי כזה, כמו בסרטים אמריקאים ישנים, מדביק לו קיק מי על הגב, כרגע רגיל, יום רגיל. It looked like just another typical day in history class, until the kids noticed that their teacher had written in large letters across the blackboard, "Strength through discipline." What's that supposed to mean? Someone asked. I'll tell you just as soon as you're all seated, Ben Ross answered. When the kids were all in their places, he began to lecture. Today I am going to talk to you about discipline. הילדים שמים לב שכתוב על הלוח באותיות ממש ממש גדולות, Strength through discipline. כוח דרך משמעת. ובן רוס אומר להם, שבו ואני אסביר, ואז הוא אומר שהיום אני אדבר איתכם על discipline, על משמעת. A collective groan went up from the seated students. אף אחד לא אוהב משמעת. There were some teachers whose classes you knew would be a drag. But most of the students expected Ross's history class to be pretty good, which meant no dumb lectures on stuff like discipline. Hold it, Ben told them. Before you make a judgment, give this a chance. It could be exciting. Oh sure, someone said. Oh sure is right, Ben told his students. Now, when I talk about discipline, I'm talking about power, he said. Making a fist, to accentuate the point. And I'm talking about success. Success through discipline. Is there anyone here who isn't interested in power and success? Probably Robert, Brad said. A bunch of kids snickered. Now wait, Ben told them. David, Brian, Eric, you play football. You already know it takes discipline to win. That must be why we haven't won a game in 2 years, Eric said, and the class laughed. אז הוא מדבר איתם על משמעת, והוא מקשר משמעת לפאוור, לכוח, והוא מקשר משמעת להצלחה. והוא שואל אותם, מי מכם לא רוצה להצליח? והוא אומר לחבר'ה, לשחקנים, לדייוויד, בריין ואריק, אתם משחקים פוטבול, אתם יודעים שצריך משמעת כדי להצליח, והם צוחקים ואומרים, כנראה בגלל זה לא ניצחנו כבר שנתיים. He took their teacher a few moments to calm them down again. Listen, he said, gesturing towards a pretty, red-haired student who appeared to be sitting taller in her chair than those around her. Andrea, you're a ballet dancer. Doesn't it take ballet dancers long, hard hours of work to develop their skills? She nodded, and Ross turned to the rest of the class. It's the same with every art. Painting, writing, music. All of them take years of hard work, discipline, and control. So what? Said a student who was slouching down in his chair. So what? Ben asked. I'll show you. Suppose I could prove to you that you can create power through discipline. Suppose we could do it right here in this classroom. What would you say to that? Ross had expected another wisecrack, and he was surprised when he didn't come. Instead, the students were becoming interested and curious. Ben went behind his desk and pulled his wooden chair in front of the room so that all the students could see it. אז הוא אומר להם, תראו, מה אם אני אוכיח לכם פה היום, כאן ועכשיו, שדרך דיסציפלין, דרך משמעת, אפשר לייצר כוח, אפשר לייצר הצלחה. ממש פה בכיתה. הייתם מעוניינים? הוא ציפה לכל מיני תגובות ככה, על כל מיני בדיחות ושטויות שתלמידים יגידו, אבל וואלה, הם לא אמרו כלום, אף אחד לא התבדח. הם פשוט ישבו וחיכו שהוא ימשיך לדבר. ואז הוא מושך את הכיסא שלו ככה לקדמת הכיתה, כדי שכל התלמידים יוכלו לראות את הכיסא. ואז הוא אומר להם ככה, All right, he said, discipline begins with posture. Amy, come up here for a minute. As Amy rose, Brian mumbled, teacher's pet. Normally that would have been enough to start the entire class laughing, but only a few chuckled. The rest ignored him. Everyone was wondering what their teacher was up to. אז אימי קמה, וישר צוחק עליה בריאן, שהיא כאילו החנפנית של המורה, ה-teacher's pet, אבל זה לא עובד לו, כי הכיתה כל כך רוצה לראות מה בן רוס זומם, שוואלה, לא מגיבים. As Amy sat in the chair in the front of the room, Ben instructed her on how to sit. אגב, posture זה איך קוראים ל-posture בעברית? עמידה? עמידה תנוחה, כאילו מנח, תנוחה, posture. שנייה רגע. איך מתרגמים posture? posture. מי שלא ידע בודק, נכון? זה קריטי לי להגיד לכם. אני כמו בן רוס, אני צריכה לספק תשובות. אוקיי, אז לפי מורפיקס, posture זה יציבה, עמידה, עמדה, מצב. אני חושבת שיציבה זה מה שהכי מתאים לנו. אז היציבה זה איך שאתה יושב, זה לא יושבת ככה, אלא you have a good posture when you sit up straight, and like, it looks different, right? זה שולח מסרים אחרים. As Amy sat in the chair in the front of the room, Ben instructed her on how to sit. Place your hands flat across the small of your back and force your spine straight up. There, can't you breathe more easily? Around the classroom, many of the students were imitating the position they saw Amy taking. But even though they were sitting straighter, some couldn't help finding it humorous. David was the next to try his hand at the joke. Is this history, or did I come to physical education by mistake? He asked. A few kids laughed, but still tried to improve their posture. אז כבר קרה משהו מעניין. אימי יושבת מול הכיתה, עושה מה שבן רוס עושה, שמה את היד כזה מאחורי הגב, ומתיישבת מאוד ישר, והילדים בכיתה, בלי להיות מודעים לזה כל כך, מתחילים לחכות אותה ולהתיישר גם בתוך הכיסאות שלהם. דיוויד מנסה ככה להתבדח, אומר מה זה חינוך גופני או היסטוריה, יש כמה צחקוקים, אבל בגדול הילדים עדיין מתיישרים בכיסאות שלהם. Come on, David, Ben said, give it a try. We've had enough wise guy remarks. Grudgingly, David pushed himself up straight in his chair. Meanwhile, their teacher walked down each aisle, checking the posture of each student. It was amazing, Ross thought. Somehow, he'd hooked them. Why, even Robert. אז בן קצת מופתע מזה שהוא מצליח. הנה, הם עושים מה שהוא אומר. אפילו רוברט יושב ישר. Class, Ben announced. I want everyone to see how Robert's legs are parallel. His ankles are locked, his knees are bent at 90 degrees. See how straight his spine is. Chin tucked in, head up. That's very good, Robert. בן רוס רואה פה הזדמנות. הוא לוקח את רוברט כאקזמפלר, כדוגמה. הוא אומר לכולם, תראו את רוברט, תראו איזה יופי הוא יושב, הרגליים ב-90 מעלות, אז זה מקביל, הכל או זה. שזה מעניין כי רוברט הוא כזה הלוזר של הכיתה, והוא לא עושה שום דבר כמו שצריך, ופתאום הוא מקבל מחמאות מהמורה שלו, על משהו שעושה כמו שצריך מול כל הכיתה. זה מאוד חריג בשביל רוברט, כנראה בחיים שלו לא קרה לו. Robert, the class nerd, looked up at his teacher and smiled briefly, then returned to his stiff upright position. Around the room, the other students tried to copy him. Ben returned to the front of the classroom. All right now, I want you all to get up and walk around the room. When I give the command, I want you to return to your seats as quickly as possible and assume the proper sitting posture. Come on, everyone, up, up, up. שלב הבא בניסוי שהוא עושה, הוא אומר לכולם לקום, להסתובב בכיתה, וברגע שהוא נותן את האות, כולם צריכים לחזור מהר מהר למקומות שלהם, כמה שיותר מהר, ולשבת אבל בפוסטר הזה הנכון. The students stood up and started wandering around the room. Ben knew he couldn't let them go too long, or they'd lose their concentration on the exercise, so he quickly said, take your seats. The students dashed back to their seats. There were bumps and grunts as a few ran into each other, and around the room some kids laughed, but the dominant sound was the loud scraping of chair legs as the kids sat down. In the front of the room, Ben shook his head. That was the most disorganized mess I've ever seen. This isn't Duck Duck Goose. This is an experiment in movement and posture. Now come on, let's try it again. This time without the chatter. The quicker and more controlled you are, the faster you will be able to reach your seats properly, okay? Now everyone, up. בן אומר להם, תקשיבו, זה הבלגן הכי גדול שראיתי בחיים שלי, אתם הולכים לעשות את זה שוב, בלי פטפוטים, בלי דיבורים, אנחנו לא משחקים משחק הכיסאות, כמה שתהיו יותר controlled, יותר אסופים ויותר ככה בשליטה, תצליחו לעשות את זה יותר מהר. For the next 20 minutes, the class practiced getting out of their seats, wandering around in apparent disorganization, and then, at their teacher's command, quickly returning to their seats and the correct seated posture. Ben shouted orders more like a drill sergeant than a teacher. Once they seemed to have mastered quick and correct seating, he threw in a new twist. They would still leave their seats and return, but now they would return from the hallway, and Ross would time them with a stopwatch. 20 דקות של זה, אוקיי? מתרגלים את הדבר הזה, ובן רוס צועק עליהם פקודות כמו איזה סמל בצבא ופחות כמו מורה, וכשהם מצליחים לעשות את זה, הוא מעלה אותם רמה, מוציא אותם למסדרון, והפעם הם צריכים לעשות את זה משם, אוקיי? הוא מכניס אותם לכיתה והם צריכים להתיישב. והוא גם שם להם סטופר, הם מתחרים בעצם נגד הזמן של עצמם. On the first try, it took 48 seconds. The second time, they were able to do it in half a minute. Before the last attempt, David had an idea. Listen, he told his classmates as they stood outside the hall waiting for Mr. Ross's signal. Let's line up in the order of who has to go the farthest to reach their desks inside. That way, we won't have to bump into each other. The rest of the class agreed. As they got into the correct order, they couldn't help noticing that Robert was at the head of the line. The new head of the class, someone whispered as they waited nervously for their teacher to give them the sign. Ben snapped his fingers, and the column of students moved quickly and quietly into the room. As the last student reached his seat, Ben clicked the stopwatch off. He was smiling. 16 seconds. The class cheered. אז קורה פה משהו מעניין. לפני הניסיון האחרון שלהם מהמסדרון, לדיוויד יש רעיון. בואו נסתדר בסדר של הישיבה שלנו, ככה שמי שנכנס ראשון זה מי שיושב הכי עמוק בכיתה. והם עושים את זה, ויצא פתאום שמי שעומד בראש הטור זה רוברט. כי רוברט תמיד תקוע בקצה של הכיתה בפינה, ומישהו אומר בצחוק שהוא פתאום the top of the class. עכשיו נכון, זה בצחוק, אבל זה סמלי, כי פתאום משהו מתהפך ברוברט, משהו קורה לו ברגע הזה. ובאמת אחרי הניסיון הזה, הם עושים את זה ב-16 שניות ובן מרוצה. All right, quiet down, their teacher said, returning to the front of the room. To his surprise, the students calmed down quickly. The silence that suddenly filled the room was almost eerie. Normally, the only time the room was that still, Ross thought, was when it was empty. Now, there are 3 more rules that you must obey. הם נכנסים לכיתה, ולא רק שהם עושים את זה פיקס, הם גם שקטים פתאום, והכיתה שקטה לחלוטין, וזה קצת weird, כאילו, זה eerie זה סוג של מפחיד מוזר כזה. והוא אומר לעצמו, וואו, יש פה כזה שקט רק שהכיתה ריקה. אני מאוד מזדהה, אגב, יש רגעים בכיתה שפתאום יש שקט מוחלט, ואני כזה, הכל בסדר? ופתאום זה מוזר, כי אנחנו כל כך רגילים לכזה, רחש בחש כזה. רחש בחש, בת כמה אני. Anyway, now there are 3 more rules that you must obey, he told them. 1. Everybody must have pencils and notepaper for note-taking. 2. When asking or answering a question, you must stand at the side of your seats. And 3. The first words you say when you're answering or asking a questions are Mr. Ross. All right? אז לבן רוס יש עכשיו 3 חוקים שהוא מציג להם. 1, כולם מגיעים עם משהו לכתוב איתו ומשהו לכתוב עליו לכיתה. צריך, זה הפורמט של בית ספר. חוק שני, כשעונים על שאלה, צריך להיעמד לצד השולחן. חוק שלישי, לפני שמתחילים לדבר, אומרים Mr. Ross. Around the room, heads nodded. הם מסכימים. All right, Mr. Ross said. Brad, who was the British Prime Minister before Churchill? Still sitting at his seat, Brent chewed nervously on a fingernail. Wasn't it? But before he could say more, Mr. Ross quickly cut him off. Wrong, Brad. You already forgot the rules I just told you. He looked across the room at Robert. Robert, show Brad the proper procedure for answering a question. Instantly, Robert stood up next to his desk at attention. Mr. Ross. Correct, Mr. Ross said. Thank you, Robert. תראו מה קורה. בן מנסה לתרגל את הכללים שהוא הרגע הוריד עליהם. הוא שואל שאלה את ברד, וברד מתחיל ככה לגמגם בלי לעשות שהוא לא נעמד ליד הכיסא, הוא לא אומר מיסטר רוס. ואז מיסטר רוס עוד פעם בא להרים לרוברט. רוברט, תראה לברד איך עושים את זה. ורוברט מדגים והוא עושה את זה נכון. פתאום רוברט נהיה הדוגמה של הכיתה. This is dumb, Brad mumbled. Just because you couldn't do it right, someone said. Brad, Mr. Ross said. Who was the Prime Minister before Churchill? This time, Brad rose and stood beside his desk. Mr. Ross, it was, Prime Minister, You're still too slow, Brad, Mr. Ross said. From now on, everyone, make your answers as short as possible and spit them out when asked. Now, Brad, try again. This time, Brad snapped up beside his seat. Mr. Ross, Chamberlain. Ben nodded approvingly. Now that's the way to answer a question. Punctual, precise, with punch. Andrea, what country did Hitler invade in September of 1939? Andrea, the ballet dancer, stood stiffly by her desk. Mr. Ross, I don't know. Mr. Ross smiled. Still, a good response because you used proper form. Amy, do you know the answer? Amy hopped up beside her desk. Mr. Ross, Poland. Excellent, Mr. Ross said. Brian, what was the name of Hitler's political party? Brian quickly got out of his chair. Mr. Ross, the Nazis. Mr. Ross nodded. That's good, Brian. Very quick. Now, does anyone know the official name of the party? Laurie? Laurie Saunders stood up beside her desk. The National Socialist. No! There was a sharp bang as Mr. Ross struck his desktop with a ruler. Now do it again correctly. Laurie sat down, a confused look on her face. What had she done wrong? David leaned over and whispered in her ear. All right, she stood up again. Mr. Ross, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Correct, Mr. Ross replied. אז בן רוס בעצם מרגיל אותם לענות על שאלות בצורה מסודרת. הם צריכים לעמוד, הם צריכים להגיד מיסטר רוס לפני שהם מדברים, והתשובה שלהם צריכה להיות מאוד ככה קצרה, punctual, precise, לא עכשיו חפירות ועניינים. תח, תשובה, תח. ושימו לב שכשאימי לא ידעה את התשובה, לא קרה שום אסון. בן רוס עדיין היה מרוצה, כי היא עשתה את זה כמו שצריך. לעומת זאת, לורי, שענתה את התשובה הנכונה, היא לא אמרה בן רוס בהתחלה, ובן רוס מגיב בכזה טרח, הוא דופק עם הסרגל שלו על השולחן, והיא נבהלת מזה קצת, ואז היא מתקנת את עצמה. Mr. Ross kept asking questions, and around the room students jumped to attention, eager to show that they knew both the answer and the correct form with which to give it. It was a far cry from the normally casual atmosphere of the classroom, but neither Ben nor his students reflected on that fact. They were too caught up in this new game. The speed and precision of each question and answer were exhilarating. Soon Ben was perspiring as he shouted each question out, and another student rose sharply beside his or her desk to shout back a terse reply. Peter, who proposed the Land Lease Act? Mr. Ross, Roosevelt. Right, Eric, who died in the death camp? Mr. Ross, the Jews. Anyone else, Brad? Mr. Ross, gypsies, homosexuals, and the feeble-minded. Good, Amy. Why were they murdered? Mr. Ross, because they weren't part of the superior race. Correct. David, who ran the death camps? Mr. Ross, the SS. Excellent. Out in the hall, the bells were ringing, but no one in the classroom moved from their seats. Still carried by the momentum of the class's progress that period, Ben stood at the front of his room and issued the final order of the day. Tonight, finish reading chapter 7 and read the first half of chapter 8. That's all, class dismissed. Before him, the class rose in what seemed like a single movement and rushed out into the hall. אז קורה עוד משהו מדהים. לא רק שהילדים עונים תח, 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 וכאילו כולם כל כך בזה שהם בכלל לא חושבים כמה זה שונה מהשיעור ככה הצ'יל הרגיל של מיסטר רוס. לא רק זה, הצלצול, מצלצל הצלצול ואף אחד לא זז עד שהוא לא משחרר אותם, וגם כשמשחרר אותם כאילו וום, קמים בבת אחת ויוצאים החוצה מהכיתה, ומשהו ממש משתנה בשיעור של מיסטר רוס. Wow, that was weird, man. It felt like a rush. Brian gasped in uncharacteristic enthusiasm. He and some of the students from Mr. Ross's class were standing in a tight pack in the corridor, still riding on the energy they felt in the classroom. I've never felt anything like that before, said Eric beside him. Well, it sure beats taking notes, Amy cracked. Yeah, Brian said. He and a couple of other students laughed. Hey, but don't knock it, David said. That was really different. It was like when we all acted together, we were more than just a class. We were a unit. Remember what Mr. Ross said about power? I think he was right. Didn't you feel it? Ah, you're taking it too seriously, said Brad behind him. Yeah, David said. Well then, how do you explain it? Brad shrugged. What's to explain? Ross asked questions, we answered them. It was like any other class, except we had to sit up straight and stand next to our desks. I think you're making a big deal out of nothing. I don't know, Brad, David said, as he turned and left the pack of students. Where are you going? Brian asked. The John, David answered, לשירותים. Catch up with you in the cafeteria. Okay, Brian said. Hey, remember to sit up straight, Brad said, and the others laughed. David pushed through the door to the men's room. He really wasn't sure if Brad was right or not. Maybe he was making a big deal out of nothing. But on the other hand, there had been the feeling that group unity, maybe it didn't make that much difference in the classroom. After all, you were just answering questions. But suppose you took that group feeling, that high energy feeling, and got the football team into it. There were some good athletes on the team. It made David mad that they had such bad record. They really weren't that bad. They were just undermotivated and disorganized. David knew that if he could ever get the team even half as charged up as Mr. Ross's history class had been that day, they could tear apart most of the teams in their league. הילדים מדברים על זה בחוץ, הם מתרגשים, הם כאילו יש להם איזה רש כזה מהשיעור, מדברים על זה, אם כן לקחת את זה ברצינות, לא לקחת את זה ברצינות, ודייוויד ישר חושב על הקבוצה שלו בפוטבול, של איך אני יכול להכניס את האנרגיה הזאת שהייתה עכשיו בכיתה של בן רוס, לתוך הנבחרת, לתוך הקבוצת פוטבול, ואולי ככה אפשר לנצח, כי יש לו שחקנים טובים בסך הכל. Inside the men's room, David heard the second bell ring, warning students that the next period was about to begin. He stepped out of a stall and was heading to the sinks when he saw someone and stopped abruptly. The men's room had emptied out, and only one person was left, Robert. He was standing in front of a mirror, tucking in his shirt, unaware that he wasn't alone. As David watched, the class loser straightened some of the hair on his head and stared at his reflection. Then he snapped to attention, and his lips moved silently, as if he was still in Mrs. Ross's class answering questions. David stood motionless as Robert practiced the move again and again. דיוויד תופס את רוברט בשירותים, מול המראה, ורוברט מסדר את עצמו, מכניס את החולצה, הוא מיישר את השיער, והוא סוג של מתאמן מול המראה, כמו שהוא עשה בשיעור של מיסטר רוס. Late that night in their bedroom, Christy Ross sat on the side of the bed in her red nightgown and brushed her long auburn hair. Near her, Ben was pulling his pajamas out of the drawer. You know, he said, I would have thought they'd all hate it, being ordered around and forced to sit straight and recite answers. Instead, they took to it like they'd been waiting for something like this their whole lives. It was weird. Don't you think they were just playing it like a game? Christy asked. Simply competing with each other to see who could be the fastest and straightest? I'm sure that was part of it, Ben told his wife. But even a game is something you either choose to play or not to play. They didn't have to play that game, but they wanted to. The strangest thing was, once we started, I could feel them wanting more. They wanted to be disciplined, and each time they mastered one discipline, they wanted another. And the bell rang at the end of the period, and they were still in their seats. I knew it meant more to them than just the game. Christy stopped brushing her hair. You mean they stayed after the bell? She asked. Ben nodded. That's what I mean. His wife looked at him skeptically, but then grinned. Ben, I think you've created a monster. Hardly, Ben replied, chuckling. Christy put down her brush and rubbed some cream into her face. On his side of the bed, Ben was pulling on his pajama top. Christy was waiting for her husband to lean over for their customary goodnight kiss, but tonight it was not forthcoming. He was still lost in thought. Ben, Christy said, yeah? Do you think you'll go on with it tomorrow? I don't think so, her husband replied. We've got to get on the Japanese campaign. Christy closed the jar of cream and settled comfortably into the bed. But on his side, Ben still had not moved. He had told his wife how surprisingly enthusiastic his students had been that afternoon, but he had not told her that he too had got caught up in it. It would almost be embarrassing to admit that he could get swept up in such a simple game. But yet, on reflection, he knew that he had. The fierce exchange of questions and answers, the quest for perfect discipline, it had been infectious and, in a way, mesmerizing. He had enjoyed his students' accomplishment, Interesting, he thought, as he got into bed. בערב, עם אשתו, בן מספר לה מה היה ואיך התלמידים התנהגו, והיא כזה, וואו, יצרת מפלצת, הם נשארו אחרי הצלצול מטורף. הוא מאוד מתרגש, הוא מאוד מתלהב. היא שואלת אותו, אתה תמשיך עם זה מחר? הוא אומר לה, לא נראה לי. ומה שהוא לא מספר לה, זה שהוא באיזשהו מקום גם נסחף לתוך הדבר הזה. הוא לא מספר לה כי זה מטריד אותו קצת, זה מביך אותו קצת, שהוא גם נסחף ככה למשחק הזה. היא קוראת לזה משחק, אולי מתלהבים כי זה רק משחק, אבל הוא גם נסחף בזה, והוא גם מרגיש שזה ככה הדביק אותו. אז סיימנו את הפרק ה5, ניפגש פעם הבאה לפרק ה6, וביי בינתיים.